Two explorers, two frozen hellscapes, two ends of the earth, and two crews on the brink of life and death, ending in two very different outcomes. These are the stories of polar explorers Shackleton, August Andrée, and Ernest Shackleton, two men who set out to conquer the frozen unknown. One expedition was met with certain icy doom, while the other managed to beat the odds and survive. And at the heart of it was one crucial difference. Not equipment, not money, not how much champagne you brought, but leadership. I'm your host, RJ McLaughlin, and today we're navigating back to a time when reaching Earth's poles wasn't a bucket list item. It was a gamble for your life. Welcome to the History Show. Around the turn of the 20th century, Earth's poles were the final frontiers of exploration. Think of it as the space race of the time. Whoever could make it to the poles representing their country would be granted fortune and fame for the rest of their lives. That fame, wealth, and national heroism brought explorers from all around the world to attempt an expedition to both the North and South Poles. Some of these men were experienced, but some not so much. One of those men was Shackleton August Andrée. In 1897, Andrée embarked on an expedition to the North Pole in a balloon of all things. Now, Andrée was a Swedish engineer who worked in a patent office, so not exactly your typical polar explorer. He also had no real Arctic survival experience, and while he fancied himself a ballooning enthusiast, he barely understood how balloons actually worked. So naturally, he was dead set on using one to go to one of the harshest places on Earth. He believed that with science, determination, and favorable breezes, I guess, he could take a hydrogen balloon, aka the Ornen, all the way from Danes Island's Svalbard to the North Pole, which is around a 650-mile journey. Now, I say favorable breezes because at this point in time, there's really no way to steer a balloon once you're up in the air, other than using a sail or, get this, hanging a rope out of the balloon and dragging it along the ground using it as a rudder. Spoiler alert, this does not work well at all. Essentially, wherever the wind took you, it took you. But somehow, Andrée was able to convince people that taking a balloon to what was at the time an unreachable destination was definitely going to work. Independent organizations, fellow scientists, and newspapers all got behind him. And while some were skeptical of the idea, institutions like the Royal Swedish Academy of Science, as well as other wealthy donors like King Oscar II of Sweden and Alfred Nobel, set him up for his Arctic expedition with both funding and endorsements, allowing Andrée to fulfill his dream of riding his silk balloon filled with hydrogen to the North Pole, with the hopes of becoming famous. But let's jump forward in time for a minute. It's about 17 years later, and the same week World War I breaks out, seasoned British explorer Ernest Shackleton sets off on his expedition to the South Pole. Unlike Andrée, Shackleton, a real explorer, had already gone on 2 expeditions to Antarctica. Once under the legacy leadership of Robert Falcon Scott, where they got within 745 miles of the pole, and once leading his own expedition where they got within 97 miles of the South Pole. Incidentally, 97 miles is what scientists refer to as really damn close. But this trip was different. He wasn't only trying to make it to the South Pole, because by this point in time, that had already been done. In order to be relevant, he needed to up the stakes. So instead, Shackleton was trying to cross the entire continent of Antarctica by foot. Coast to coast, right through the middle, by foot. Though there were supposed to be supply depots set up along the way for the journeying crew, the team would still need to bring most of what they needed with them, hauled by dog teams and sleds, across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. It was the first attempt of its kind. And while Andrée had the backing of a literal king and his expedition was treated as a national project, Shackleton had to hustle. Combined with the fact that the South Pole had already been reached and his previous attempts had failed, funding a polar expedition wasn't a top priority for the British. They gave him some money, but it really wasn't enough. So he was forced to raise the money himself, charming private donors with his bold promises and relentless PR. From these sources, Shackleton raised over $175,000, including $120,000 from Sir James Caird, a Scottish industrialist who believed heavily in Shackleton's vision to cross Antarctica. By the way, that's millions of dollars today. And with this, Shackleton eventually got his hands on the boat that would take him and his crew to Antarctica, and he named it the Endurance. Speaking of crew, whenever you go on an expedition like this, getting the right people and planning ahead are essential. But Andrée and Shackleton's approach could not have been more different. Shackleton assembled a crack team of skilled sailors, carpenters, navigators, doctors, scientists, dog handlers, and photographers, choosing only 23 men from over 5,000 applicants to sail specifically on the Endurance with him. Additionally, 3 men were hired when the crew was docked in Buenos Aires, and 1 snuck aboard. Right place, right time. Or I guess, very wrong place, very wrong time. A few standouts on Shackleton's hand-selected team were New Zealander Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, and one of the finest navigators alive. He also brought along Australian Frank Wild, second in command and Shackleton's right-hand man, and Frank Hurley, the Australian photographer who risked life and limb to document everything. Also, I just realized that all those guys were named Frank. It's a lot of Franks. And of course, it wasn't just men Shackleton and Andrée were bringing along. It was equipment too. And once again, these leaders had very different priorities. Shackleton's Endurance carried literal tons of supplies for the expedition, including, but not limited to, 69 dog sleds, ample food stores filled with 3.5 tons of flour, rice, sugar, barley, lentils, vegetables, and jam. This along with biscuits as a treat, and 5,000 pounds of seal meat and blubber. But that's just the food. Additionally, they brought tents, medical equipment, coal, guns, ice tools, skis, and an 11th edition Encyclopedia Britannica set, which, side note, I actually own. I found this out while researching for this episode. It's all these leather-bound books on the bookshelf back here. My grandfather originally saved these from a building that was about to be demolished years ago, and my family has just kind of held on to them ever since. And once I found out, I obviously had to add them to the set design, so there you go, a little lore drop for you. But on top of all the encyclopedias, Shackleton also brought surgical equipment, navigation equipment, 3 lifeboats, woodworking tools, and of course, lots of tobacco. Oh, and a singular banjo for those sick crew-wide jams. And then there's Andrée, who only brought 2 other men with him. Nils Strindberg, a 24-year-old physicist and photographer, as well as Knut Frankel, a civil engineer who replaced a crew member who, get this, backed out early because the balloon fabric was leaking hydrogen and Andrée was just gonna use it anyway. Why would you replace that guy? Now, in terms of equipment, Andrée's balloon carried the following: cold weather clothes for all the men, a camera, a few guns, some navigation equipment, provisions such as tinned meat, canned vegetables, concentrated lemon juice to prevent scurvy, and chocolate. Oh, and of course champagne, which I can only assume they brought so as to not drink only water like barbarians while exploring the desolate wilderness from a balloon. Do you see where I'm going with this? Needless to say, there were some distinct differences between the 2 expeditions. While Andrée envisioned glory and leaned on his grand ideas rather than testing, Shackleton braced for hardship and planned for the worst from the start. But regardless, both men started their journeys. On July 11th, 1897, with bad weather and a balloon that was still leaking, Andrée took to the skies. You see, he had already delayed his launch once before due to wind conditions and wasn't about to do it again because waiting is for waiters. They left from Danes Island, cheered on by a crowd of locals and supporters who were gathered to send the 3 men off on their adventure. And then everything went wrong immediately. Basically, as the balloon flew through the cold, damp Arctic air, water vapor from the atmosphere froze into the balloon's fabric, creating a layer of slush, weighing the balloon down and making it lose altitude. This, coupled with the hydrogen leak that was still happening, made this situation even worse. For the next 2 days, the balloon just kind of bobbed over the Arctic Sea, losing altitude. At times, it even scraped across the ice below, forcing the men to drop weight by throwing their sand ballast and even some of their supplies and payload overboard just to stay afloat. They ended up dropping over 440 pounds worth of stuff out of the balloon. But it wasn't enough, and on July 14th, just 65 hours and 33 minutes after their initial launch, the Ornen came down for good. They landed on a drifting pack of ice, stranded in the middle of nowhere with absolutely nowhere to go. Though on the bright side, despite landing pretty abruptly, they had managed to make the long-distance flight record at the time, so it was like basically worth it, other than them getting stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way of getting out. Other than that, it was worth it. Meanwhile, on December 5th, 1914, the Endurance left South Georgia Island, headed for Antarctica. And by Christmas that year, the men had actually made it. From there, they began their creep inward towards the South Pole through narrow channels of water, trying to push forward while the passage was still open. But on January 18th, 1915, just 6 weeks after their initial departure from the South Georgia island, it happened. The Endurance got stuck on the ice, and while the crew chopped at the ice with their ice picks trying to break her free, their efforts were useless. The ship was locked in place with nowhere to go, and no one coming to save her or her crew. So just to put it into perspective, at this point in each of their stories, both men and their crews are stuck. One frozen in ice, the other grounded in snow. 2 crews, 2 poles, no clear path home. Now, after crash landing in the Arctic, Andrée and his crew found themselves in less than ideal circumstances. They concluded that their best chance of making it to safety was to head south towards mainland Siberia, towards a supply depot that had been left for them. So the 3 men started their trek, leaving almost nothing behind, which is great for preparedness, but also makes for a pretty heavy load. Each one had their own sledge they were in charge of for carrying supplies on board, only none of these men were trained for these conditions and for this level of intensity. Even lightening their loads after several weeks of walking with their sledges overloaded, the toll started to take hold. By the 5th week, things were looking pretty grim. Frankel had dislocated his knee and became sick, but with no other option in sight, he had no choice but to pop that baby back in place and keep moving. They all trudged forward, falling into the ice and battling exhaustion. Now, on the other side of the planet, and 18 years later, Shackleton was facing his own problems. With his ship stuck, he and his 27 crewmates were now in a life or death scenario. Shackleton was forced to start making some critical decisions. First, he started off by making sure every man was working and had a routine, both for the sake of the boat and for the sake of the men themselves. He also knew it was his job to uplift crew morale, so in addition to regular chores, he held soccer games on the ice, and even dog sledding races, which sounds awesome. I'm a big Iditarod guy, so this sounds pretty sick. Other than the part of them being trapped in the barren Antarctic wilderness, that probably wasn't as sick, but he was able to keep this up for around 10 months in the Antarctic, up until October 1915, when the shifting ice finally started to close and the ship was crushed. The men were forced to move themselves and their belongings out onto the ice, dragging everything they could carry off of the ship. For months, Shackleton and his crew lived on this drifting sea ice, stretching their rations and continuing their daily duties. Although some became sick or injured, everyone was able to recover and stay relatively healthy, long enough at least for Shackleton to make his big move. You see, as the men camped on the drifting ice, it slowly carried them north, as they had hoped, closer to the possibility of land. But as the temperature began to rise, the ice began to weaken, and on April 9th, it finally split beneath them, prompting Shackleton to give the order to break down camp and launch the lifeboats. Now, Shackleton still had most of his navigation equipment, and with the help of his navigator, one of the Franks, Frank Worsley, he was able to pinpoint a reachable destination, Elephant Island. Now, thanks to the drifting of the ice that I mentioned earlier, the men were close enough to actually see the island on the horizon, and while it was uninhabited, it would give them just a little more time to find help. So, wasting no time, the order was made, and all 28 men in their lifeboats proceeded to sail 7 days straight in freezing temperatures with soaked clothes and limited rations all the way to at least partial safety at Elephant Island. It was the first solid land these men had stood on in 497 days, and while it was nice, it was still uninhabited and far from any shipping routes. The men found themselves in a slightly better position, but still stuck. But at least they were able to rest a bit. Unlike Andrée and his crew, after months of dragging overloaded sledges on the bitterly cold ice and changing direction, Andrée, Strindberg, and Frankel finally reached solid land. It was a desolate spot called Kvitøya, or White Island, off the northeastern coast of Svalbard. The men, wet, freezing, exhausted, and running out of supplies, decided to set up a camp along the rocky shore. But unfortunately, it was too late. Within 3 days, all 3 of the men passed away. And as October 1897 rolled around, they disappeared into the ice. It wasn't until 33 years later when the camp was found frozen in time. Among the rubble was the remains of journals, film, and photographs that documented the journey. In the southern hemisphere, Shackleton and his crew struggled not to meet the same fate. At this point, Shackleton was aware that due to the rations and exposure to the elements, the men could not survive for much longer. So, with the help of his navigator, Frank Worsley, Shackleton once again hatched a plan. Using one of the 22-foot wooden lifeboats named the James Caird, Shackleton and 5 men would sail 800 miles of open ocean across some of the worst seas on Earth with only a map and sextant to get help. For 17 days, the crew of 6 fought hurricane winds and freezing temperatures, but eventually made it to South Georgia Island, where the only civilization was at a whaling station on the other side of the island. Shackleton and his crew proceeded to climb over an uncharted mountain range to reach the whaling station, eventually getting help. But the mission wasn't over. There were still 22 men stranded on Elephant Island, and with winter coming fast, they had a limited window to save them. Within 2 weeks after landing on South Georgia, Shackleton hopped on a boat named the Southern Sky, but was unable to make it to the island due to sea ice blocking any entrance. He would go back in June with no luck, July with no luck. But finally, on his 4th attempt in August 1916 aboard the Yelko, Shackleton was able to make it to Elephant Island, saving the Endurance's crew, with all 27 alive. Shackleton had just done the impossible. So why did Shackleton succeed and Andrée fail? Well, it's easy to say that success comes down to who had the better gear and the more realistic plan. And sure, that matters, but what stood out to me is how much of that only works when the person in charge knows how to use it. Shackleton's tools didn't save him and his crew. His leadership did. What I've learned isn't just that grit and resilience matter, because they definitely do, but that survival demands humility. Shackleton made decisions based on the moment, not the dream, whereas Andrée did the opposite. He clung to the vision even when it was irresponsible to do so. So maybe it's a lesson less about strength and more about knowing when to bend. And also a lesson on not flying an uncontrollable balloon into the Arctic, but that one I thought was pretty obvious. Thank you to everybody who helped make this episode. If you have any other buried historical stories you want us to dig up, let us know in the comments. If you see stories below you like, you can upvote them and we'll add them to our ever-growing list of topics. Also, if you want to see more of what we're up to, you can join the Complexly newsletter by visiting complexly.com. I'm your host, RJ McLaughlin, and I will see you in the next episode.